Let's talk about the ideal translation process. And when I say ideal, I mean realistically ideal. And it might differ from team to team, from translator to translator, but I think that the crux will be the same. Just like I coach running, and people say, but all runners are different. True, all their styles are slightly different, but the basic components are the same because they all have to follow the laws of gravity and so forth. So the four absolutely necessary elements of translation are translating, review, by which I mean a meaning check and consistency to the original, editing, by which I mean style, checking the style in the target language, and proofreading, by which I mean fixing the typos, commas, and so forth. These are the four basic steps, but we can get a lot more expanded and detailed about them. Instead of giving you a very boring lecture, let me illustrate by using examples of projects we have done. So the last big book, and actually it was the biggest book in my career that I've ever translated, was called Business IQ, otherwise known as Business Intellect. I was the translator, so how did it go? We secured the project, which is actually like step 0 or -1 or whatever of the translation process, and then we went to town. So as I'm translating, I'm asking the author millions, billions, sextillions of questions. I'm exaggerating slightly, but I actually counted up approximately how many questions we asked the author, and it was around 2,500 questions for that book. So I get very, very detailed and involved about wanting to know the meaning behind the words because there were ambiguities, stylistic points, inconsistencies with facts, and so forth. So actually, as I'm translating, that's kind of the bonus. We are fact-checking, we are slightly editing if something doesn't make sense, and we're clarifying. One of the authors actually that I worked with, not this guy too, but another guy said, you know, I realized that your translation has the added bonus of actually clarifying my text. And very often authors will then insert these edits back into the original. So I'm translating, doing all my due diligence, whatever, like synonyms and clarifications and definitions. Then I'm done as a translator, and that rough draft in itself is already probably mighty good, but you don't stop there, right? I check myself for meaning, usually twice, sometimes once if it's late at night or I'm feeling lazy and I know I'll have other reviewers, but always twice in the final analysis. So I will check myself for meaning twice. And as I'm checking for meaning, I'm sort of putting on the hat of this nasty reviewer. And even if it's not the same person, especially if it's not the same person, if you're the reviewer, not the translator, you're sort of like the bad cop, the nasty cop. And your statistic, if you had a statistic, would be real mistakes found. You don't want to find mistakes that are not mistakes, but you do want to find mistakes that are true and real. And that's what a reviewer is looking for, right? Like, does it say lake and the guy said pond? Does it say pigeon and the guy said dove? Does it say peaked cap and he said something else? So like, what are the meaning inconsistencies? Okay, sure, if I see a typo at this point, I will fix it, but I'm not searching for typos. I'm not searching for stylistic edits either, although I will make them if I see them. I hope that makes sense. So I'm done with that. When I'm happy, I will edit myself stylistically. Like, I'll read it now just in the target language, not necessarily looking at the source anymore, and edit myself stylistically. But we will leave the source language in the text. We usually, like, let's say it's a book from Russian into English, and usually we go paragraph by paragraph or 2 paragraphs, 2 paragraphs. So Russian, English, Russian, English, Russian, English. And that makes it really easy to quality check. Some people might have a printed out version. That's like really up to you. But in my team, that's what we do. We also don't do track changes because I hate it. And I'm kind of like the big and evil boss. All right, so once I'm done and I'm happy that I did a good job stylistically, I deliver it to the reviewer as if it were the final translation. Just because I have a reviewer, I don't shed the responsibility onto the reviewer. So it goes to, let's say it's Rick, who is my colleague. And Rick has gotten mighty nasty over the years, so he sees a lot of things, and he will comment on these things, and he'll say, you know, Vladimir, I think the author might mean something else here. You missed a slight nuance here, blah, blah, blah. And very often these comments will inspire more questions to the author. And I'll comment on how I deal with authors very wickedly. No, I'm just kidding. But then it comes back to me from Rick. I go through all of these comments, and in my team, just purely logistically, we use the side comment feature in Word. Like, because I don't like track changes, I don't like anything changed in the text without me and my permission. Sure, they can like change stray typos, but nothing else. I like to see comments, and then I go through and deal with these comments. Yes, I agree. No, I disagree. And I remove as many of these comments as I possibly can. Then ideally, on books, I always have this. I have 2 reviewers usually, right? Because I want to make sure nothing gets lost in translation. If it's a smaller job, like an affidavit, something else, not that they're not important, but usually 1 reviewer is enough. And if you don't have a reviewer, you're your own reviewer, right? But I find that it's always good to pair up with somebody and have a reviewer. So I send it to the second reviewer, same deal, same procedure. I'm not going to describe it again. It comes back to me, I deal with it. If I have questions to the editor that are sort of like stylistic, I leave these comments and I might comment on the comment. I'll be like, Morgan, Sabrina, these were both my real editors. What do you think? The evil Rick, you know, is saying this, but what do you actually think? But this is rare because usually I deal with as many, ideally, you deal with as many comments as you can. Then it goes to the editor. At some point, we also have involved conversations with the author, but we'll just put it to the side for now. Now, the editor very often does not speak the source language, though they might. For example, on a book, Invasion, that we translated from Russian to English, the editor did speak Russian. He is a native of English. He's from Iowa, my friend Steve, and a very good editor and translator, but he spoke Russian. He actually caught a few mistakes, like occupiers and occupants and so forth. The word occupante was translated as occupants and it should be occupiers. Anyway, and the editor's job, you get some fun beeping effects. Too bad. The editor's job is stylistic editing. They're looking for anything that would not sound natural, in this case in English, right? The target language. So they're fixing it stylistically, but especially if the translator is not a native of English or the target language, there might be something kind of quote unquote weird, and a good editor should say, I'm not sure what that means. Let's inquire. And this is actually one really important thing. You have to educate your editors, because some editors have been educated into making educated guesses and thinking, oh, it means this, I'm just gonna fix it as this. You know, like for example, it says my advocate, and maybe in the original it said lawyer, and maybe, well, maybe that's not the best example, but they kind of assume what it's supposed to mean, and they assume wrong. So you have to educate the editor that unless they're 100% certain of what they're editing, they have to ask. And also it depends whom they're editing. Like if somebody is editing me, then they're not allowed to make big changes. They're allowed to make like minute changes and comment on everything else, because I'm a control freak and I want to be in control of my own text. Not control freak, but I like to have responsibility for my translation and call it mine. Then it comes back from the editor with comments. I deal with them. Usually it will be a back and forth of like 1-2 times, and then if it goes more than 2 sendings, I will call them up and say, hey, let's just discuss this on the phone. And that's it. And then once it's done, it goes to the proofreader, and the proofreader should handle it once it's pretty much final. We also have a rule that if after the proofreader has checked it and something has changed, we always highlight it, usually in green, because when you make changes, you can inadvertently enter a proofreading mistake. And it's happened, and I have this little paranoia about it. Not paranoia, just being cautious, and we mark it and the proofreader does another check. Now about working with the author. At any point during this process, between translation and proofreading, I usually accumulate questions for the author, like, what did you mean here? It's like, for example, in English we have 2 words, efficient and effective. They are similar, but they mean slightly different things. Effective just means getting the result, getting the job done, while efficient usually means using the least resources or in the least amount of time. In Russian, there's usually 1 word for this, effektivny, and it means both. So for example, if I have this word, I'd be like, did you mean this, or did you mean this, or did you mean both? And I will go with the English term depending on what they say, or I might opt for both if they say both. This kind of gives you an idea. Or for example, the last book I translated was a small book called The Role of a Lady, or at least that's what we went with. And even that title we discussed a lot with the author, and we surveyed it, and some people don't like it, but the survey, that's what won the survey. And we discussed many, many things, because very often authors will be experts and geniuses of their craft, but they're not necessarily wordsmiths. So you have to get used to this. especially if you're working with a raw manuscript, that it will not always say what it is supposed to say. And you have to be almost telepathic and guess at, okay, I think the author meant this, but not change it without their permission. And I have always had the luxury, pretty much, of having direct contact with the author, so I can just ask him, what exactly did you mean? And sometimes you have to ask that once, twice, thrice, and so forth. And the more specifically you ask that question, the better, just like in interpreting. Let's see. Obviously, people can talk about things like localization, which means adapting it to the target audience. Yes, of course, these things should be also discussed with the author, ideally. Like, the author is your partner, the author is your friend, not necessarily, you know, pal friend, not necessarily like beer pal or beer buddy, but like your comrade, to use a very Soviet word, because they want the book to come out in the best possible fashion. Some people think that plaguing the author with questions is going to bother them. It has never happened in my experience. Usually they start thinking of you as a true professional because you want to keep the book true to source, true to their intention, true to their emotion, and so forth, you know? But I always actually, before I decide if I'm going to take on a project, I always ask the author, I will have many questions. Will you answer them for me in a more or less timely fashion? And if they're like, no, I don't care, I'm like, do I really want this project? We could talk at great length about each and every one of these steps, but I think we've covered it to some extent, to some degree. Read my book, Translation Diaries, because especially I think the chapter is called My Translation Library, because I give very specific examples that just didn't necessarily pop into my mind right now. I need more pop for them to pop into my mind. Very corny joke, but anyway, you'll forgive me. So we're gonna end off, because we have this beautiful Minneapolis, not skyline, but high rises behind us. We're at Loring Park, by the way. I have no idea who Loring was, but I'll see you guys in the next clip. This was a bit more of a serious technical clip, but I think for all of you translators out there in the world or in the universe, it was useful, I hope. Thank you for your attention, and I'll see you later.